Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to answer a question that must perplex many Tai Chi practitioners. Where is elbow strike in the Tai Chi forms? After all, elbow strike is one of the 8 fundamental energies of Tai Chi, so why can't we find it anywhere in the forms, or at least anything resembling what might look like an elbow strike? The fact is, you can find elbow strike in the forms, not in just 1 or 2 places, but you can find elbow strike in almost every technique. And I'm going to show you exactly where, and at the same time, I'm going to show you where you can find all of the other energies of Tai Chi within the forms. And all I ask in return is for you to click the like button and leave me a comment and let me know what you think, especially if you're a Tai Chi practitioner. Well, if you're looking for something that resembles an elbow strike, you're probably not going to find that in the forms. But if you're looking for this, the trigram energy of elbow strike, that is what you're going to find everywhere in the forms. But to find it, you have to know what this means. What does the trigram mean? This one and all of the other of the 8 trigrams. The problem is, reliable sources would tell us that there is no concrete definition of the 8 trigrams. The energies are explained only in vague metaphors. This is not enough for us to be able to find these energies within the form. Some people would say that the 8 trigrams are not meant to be explained. But I would differ with that because I have gone through and worked out a theory that is completely demonstrably true that does explain the 8 trigrams. And I'm going to show you that right here so I can identify elbow strike within the forms for you as well as all of the other 8 energies. So let's look at the Tai Chi trigram and ask, what could this mean in terms of mechanical movements of the body? Well, we have 3 elements, 3 lines representing yin and yang. We can use Tai Chi theory and ask, what could these 3 lines represent? Well, we know from Tai Chi theory and practice that all movements are guided by the waist and powered by the legs. So that would be 2 elements, waist and legs. If we look at the legs, we are powering the legs almost exclusively with our hip joints. We can either extend the hip joint to power a strike, or we can flex the hip joint to power a strike. What's going on in the knees and the ankles is more peripheral and reflexive and not the real power of the movement. So we have energy powering from the hips. Then we have the waist. Well, do we only have one waist? We all know that we have lower abs, which means we also have upper abs. We have 2 divisions of the waist. Lower waist, which rotates the lumbar spine and the pelvis. Primarily you can think of the internal oblique muscles here. And then we have the upper part of the waist, which is going to rotate the thoracic spine. And combined with the lower waist, we have 2 divisions of waist rotation. So if we think about this now, we have 2 divisions of waist rotation and 1 element of hip action or power. That creates 3 specific elements which would line up with the trigrams. So let's try to figure out which of the lines is represented by which of the 3 elements, upper waist, lower waist, and hip joints, and then what is the definition of yin and what is the definition of yang. It would seem that that is what we need to have in order to figure out what each one of these 8 energies represents. Let's start with the hips because that's the easiest to define. If I'm going to use power and strike at somebody by extending my hip, that would appear to be expansive energy or yang, as opposed to if I was going to flex my hip up, retreating it away, that would be yin. Now that doesn't mean I can't flex my hip towards somebody and that also be aggressive. But if we're going to compare yin and yang, it would make much more sense that extension of the hip is going to be much more aggressive than flexion of the hip. especially if my leg is on the ground. Extending the hip is going to push me in the direction of somebody. Flexion of the hip is going to pull me around in a circle or in a more retreating or curving fashion, not very direct. So we have hip energy, yang being extension, yin being flexion of the hip. Now we have to go to the waist rotation, upper waist and lower waist. Now we have counterclockwise or clockwise rotation of each one of these two elements. How can we define them in terms of yin and yang energy? It's not as simple as the hips, because counterclockwise and clockwise are equally the same sort of movements. They're both rotations. But if we look at them in relationship to the hip energy, we get something very different. If we rotate towards our extending hip, as I extend from my glutes and I turn the body towards it using the upper waist or the lower waist, what we're going to see is that rotation is going to expand my arm outward naturally because of the rotation of the waist turning against the extension of the hip. And you can practice this for yourself and see how it expands the energy of the arm outward with no action from the shoulder joint. Now let's think if we flex the hip and we rotate towards the flexing hip, you're going to see what happens now. No expanding energy outward. The arm rotates into that hip or retreats into that flexing hip. So what we can say by that is turning towards an extending hip is yang energy, and turning towards a flexing hip is yin energy. We can also determine that turning away from an extending hip is going to be yin. How can we think about this? Imagine a baseball coming and I'm going to hit it with the bat. If I have the ball coming in towards the bat, both of them accelerating towards each other as they collide and produce this expansive energy during that collision, that is yang. But instead, what if I toss the ball away from me and I chase the ball with the bat? When I connect, it's going to have much less expansive energy. So that would be yin. So what we're determining here is that turning towards an extending hip is yang, turning away from an extending hip is yin. And likewise, turning towards a flexing hip is going to be yin, and turning away from a flexing hip is going to be yang. There's a few more permutations of this, but they all follow the same thread. And so now we have a decent understanding of what yin and yang could represent and what the three elements of the trigram could represent. And now let's see if we can correlate that with what we know from how we practice the Tai Chi forms. And then let's see if we can find elbow strike within that, as well as the other 8 elements. Let's look at a motion that we all know as Tai Chi practitioners, ward off. Ward off is 3 yang lines. So I mentioned we would have yang energy of the hip extending against the ground, and I would have my upper and lower waist turning in a curving fashion towards that extending hip. What does that produce in the arms? Does it look like what we would see in ward off in, let's say, grasp the sparrow's tail? As I extend and rotate both elements of the waist towards the extending hip, what it does is projects my arm out in a curving fashion. And it would be very difficult to break my arm inwards this way because all of this energy is creating a structure. And the structure is so strong that even if I relax my shoulder and completely drop it, that's what happens. My shoulder is up in this position not because I am putting it there, it's because the rotational energy of the core is putting my shoulder here. And again, I'm just going to completely let my shoulder go limp, and that's what happens. If I now rotate my lower waist away, Now see what happens with the shoulder. It just naturally dropped. It was the rotation of the core supporting that position of the arm, and that's why ward-off is so difficult to break. Now let's see if we can determine which line is which on the trigrams. We already looked at ward-off, where all three lines are yang, so we don't really even have to figure that out. Once we go past ward-off, we need to figure out which line represents which of the elements of the core. And we can simply go to a few other known movements. Let's say push, that I might do in brush knee, pushing with the right palm. I'm extending my right hip using the glutes, and I'm turning my upper waist away from that hip, which is projecting my arm out. That is yin energy from the upper waist. And we know push has a broken second line and a solid third line. So that would indicate to us that the upper waist rotation, yin, in push is going to be the broken second line. We can also see that the lower waist, our lower abs, as I push, are turning back towards my right leg or my right hip, causing the pelvis to push off of that extending energy, yang energy there with the lower waist. So I have a solid yang line from the hips, a broken yin line for the upper waist, and a solid yang line for the lower waist rotation in push. I can do this for a number of different Tai Chi energies, but we don't really need that at this point. All we know right now is that the top line is the hip energy, second line is the upper waist rotation, third line is the lower waist rotation. And in terms of why we have 8 energies, we have 2 directions of waist rotation from the upper waist, counterclockwise or clockwise. We have 2 directions of waist rotation from the lower waist, counterclockwise or clockwise. And then we have 4 options for the hip energy: flexion or extension of the right hip, or flexion or extension of the left hip. When we multiply those out, we get 16 unique combinations of energy. And if we subtract the mirror images, we are left with 8 specific combinations which correlate with the 8 energies of Tai Chi. So now we have all of the elements together. We have our yin and yang, we have the 3 elements, and we know what those 3 elements are. And now let's see if we can find elbow strike in the trigram using those principles. So in elbow strike, we have a broken top line, which would mean hip flexion, and then we have solid second and third lines, meaning yang energy from the waist turning away from the flexing hip. And we see this in the forms all the time. When we are collecting into empty stance, I first am going to flex my right hip as I turn the upper waist towards it and the lower waist away from it. That's what gets us this motion here. This will turn out to be split. And then what I do to collect fully into empty stance is turn the upper waist now away from the flexing hip, and that is going to allow the flexing hip to collect up here into empty stance. I now have a flexed right hip and counterclockwise rotation of the upper and lower waist. And you'll kind of notice as I do that, and I'll do it from the side view, that the elbow comes out as I form the ball here. Kind of interesting. It's not quite an elbow strike, but I am creating a pointed motion with the elbow as I go into that position. So that energy is elbow strike, even though we're not technically doing an elbow strike. That correlates with the trigrams. We'll also know from studying some Tai Chi theory that it's indicated that elbow strike is in the 5 elements, or the 5 directions: advancing step, retreating step, step to the left, step to the right, and central equilibrium. So do we see elbow strike in the terms that I've just defined within those 5 elements? So let's see. I just gave you an example of stepping up into the ball carrying position, which is elbow strike, which we do before we step out for an advancing step, let's say for parting the wild horse's mane. So we see elbow strike in an advancing step. We also are going to see elbow strike in a retreating step. Let's look at repulse monkey. When we step up from repulse monkey, we have a flexed left hip, and we have the upper waist turning towards that left hip, lower waist turning away from that left hip, which correlates with the trigram of split. And then we step backwards. How do we step backwards from here? What we do is rotate the upper waist away from this flexing hip, and that is what creates that backward movement in repulse monkey. This motion is elbow strike. Flexed left hip, clockwise rotation of the upper and lower waist. Let me go through that again. From this position, I have torsional rotation on the right. Upper waist turning counterclockwise, lower waist turning clockwise. I step back simply by turning the upper waist clockwise, now producing concordant clockwise rotation of the waist, flexion of the left hip. Now, you might think my left hip is extending, but if I actually were to push off, extend my left hip, you're going to topple yourself over. The left hip is not in an extension during that back step. The left hip is in flexion. So we see elbow strike in the retreating step. Now let's see step to the left and step to the right. I'll begin with the end of repulse monkey because I'm going to turn around and step as if I was stepping out to the left to do Fair Lady Works the Shuttle. The first thing I'm going to do is collect, turn, and then step out. So elbow strike we're going to see in here a couple different times. After we turn around, I'm going to use elbow strike to collect my weight. I have clockwise rotation of both upper and lower waist, and I have flexion of my left hip. Now I'm going to turn the upper waist to the left, then I'm going to turn my upper waist back to the right for the step out. That is elbow strike, and then I can perform Fair Lady Works the Shuttle. I won't do Fair Lady Works the Shuttle to the right because the principle is the same. We step out using a combination of elbow strike, split, elbow strike. That gives us the diagonal step as opposed to doing a step with split, elbow strike, press to step out for an advancing step. The final of the 5 directions is going to be central equilibrium. Now we can do this in 2 different ways. One is going to be keeping the weight balanced all on one leg, as we might do prior to doing a kick. And in that circumstance, what we're going to be doing is split, followed by elbow strike, to get to central equilibrium with 100% of my weight on my left leg. We can also get to central equilibrium in the opening posture. I'm going to sink using elbow strike with flexion of my right hip and counterclockwise rotation of the waist. And now I'm going to flex my left hip with clockwise rotation of both upper and lower waist. And that's what sinks me into this position. I am in elbow strike, flexed left hip, clockwise rotation of the upper and lower waist. If I was in the 24 form, I would want to start off into parting the wild horse's mane by turning the upper waist from right to left, and that's what starts me here. Now I'm left to right and I'm back into central equilibrium on one leg using elbow strike prior to stepping out. Now this is another fun thing you can do and practice on your own if you really want to see an elbow strike in terms of what we would visualize as an elbow strike. If you're doing grasp the sparrow's tail and you shift forward in press, which I'm going to demonstrate in a second, is flexion of the hip, upper waist turning away from that hip, lower waist turning towards that hip. That's press. What we're going to do is turn press into elbow strike by turning my lower waist from left to right. And what's going to happen is that it's going to throw my elbow because I have a twisting energy going to the right with the waist, and I have a pulling energy going to the left from the hip, because hip flexion is really a pulling energy. And so I can go from press to elbow strike, and that's actually going to create an elbow strike. I'm turning my upper waist to the right, lower waist to the right, flexion of my left hip. That's the movement there, and it creates what we would predict to see visualized as an elbow strike. So very interesting. Now I promised I would show you where you could find the other 7 energies all throughout the forms. And I've mentioned a couple of them very quickly, but we have split when we're turning the upper waist towards the flexing hip, lower waist away from the flexing hip. We'll see split before we step up to the carry the ball position. We'll see split when we step up from brush knee going into play the fiddle. I'm going to flex my right hip and use torsional rotation on the left. I'm going to shift back using split, flexion of the left hip, torsional rotation on the right, and then I'm going to go into elbow strike by turning my upper and lower waist to the right, and then I'm going to step down using pluck. I'll demonstrate pluck right now. Pluck is going to be a solid top line, yang energy in the hip, a solid second line, yang energy from the upper waist, and a broken lower line, yin energy from the lower waist. And so we have extension of the hip, upper waist turning towards the extending hip, lower waist turning away from the extending hip. That is going to be pluck. We're also going to see pluck here and pick up needles at the C bottom. I'm turning towards the extending left hip with the upper waist. Lower waist is rooting my right leg, turning backwards. Pluck. We're also going to see pluck coming into single whip. After we pivot around from grasp the sparrow's tail, I'm going to begin doing pluck, which is going to fold the hand into the crane's beak position as I turn against the extending hip at the lower, and the lower waist turns away from the extending hip. That is going to create the crane's beak position as the energy of the waist rotation against the hip energy pushing against it causes the hand to fold in. It's a natural action that occurs when I do pluck. Now I'm actually going to go to elbow strike here. Pluck again, step out with press, shift forward with split, and then I'm going to extend my hip, turning split into pluck. So we've seen elbow strike, split, and pluck. I also demonstrated earlier ward off, upper and lower waist turning towards the extending hip. And then roll back is going to be the opposite, upper and lower waist turning towards the flexing hip. We're going to see this in grasp the sparrow's tail. When I'm turning my upper and lower waist towards my right hip as it's flexing, and that's going to cause the retreating energy of the movement. Now, a lot of people describe rollback as turning the waist away from the flexing hip, which is really not what's going on. If we were to turn away as we flexed the right hip, we would end up changing the root and just collecting over to this leg. We need to keep the root on the right leg as we roll back. The root's created by that rotation of the waist towards that leg. That is rollback. Now I'm going to change my upper and lower waist to the other direction, counterclockwise. From here, if I was going to go into step forward and parry punch. So now we've seen rollback. Then let's show us shoulder strike. Shoulder strike, we have a yang hip energy, and we have upper and lower waist turning away from that extending yang hip, which is why we have a broken line for the second and third lines. Upper waist turning away from the extending hip, lower waist turning away from the extending hip. That is shoulder strike, and the energy you can see in the trigram. But you'll also see this version of raise hands and shoulder strike following single whip, where we step back right into crane cools its wings. That step back is shoulder strike because we have extension of the hip on the right and upper and lower waist turning away from the extending hip. So that is shoulder strike moving into crane cools its wings, just like this was shoulder strike moving into crane cools its wings. Now crane cools its wings, that last portion is also split. We can see the arms splitting. We're going from elbow strike. I have flexion of my left hip and clockwise rotation of the upper and lower waist. I turn my upper waist to the left, and that is going to produce the splitting action. All I have to do to move from here to here is turn the waist to the left, creating the split energy, and the rest of the movements of the shoulders and the legs happen automatically. Rotate the waist, changing elbow strike to split. The final energy that I'm going to show you is press. We've already seen me do it multiple times. Press is flexion of the hip, torsional rotation on the same side of that hip. So upper waist turning away, lower waist turning towards it. So the most obvious version of press is here in grasp the sparrow's tail. I go from press to push by extending the left hip. And now we have two different versions in grasp the sparrow's tail. This one here, where I push down with the palms and keep the ball of the foot on the ground, that is push. Extension of my right hip with torsional rotation on the right. And then I do push forward by extending my left hip with torsional rotation on the left. But there's also this common version where we sink back and lift the forefoot and push forward. That is not push, that is press. Flexion of the hip, torsional rotation on the side of that flexing hip. So we had press from the left hip, push from the left hip, now press from the right hip, and then push from the left hip. The final thing I'm going to demonstrate is how we frequently switch from a torsional rotation on one side to a torsional rotation on the other side to create a striking energy. And it's very difficult to see the rotations happening because we're really doing this sort of twist of the torso, one side turning in one direction, the other side turning in the other direction, creates a powerful strike, but we don't see what we would think of as rotation of the waist. One example is in Fair Lady Works the Shuttle. I have torsional rotation on the left as I extend my right hip. That's going to be pluck to begin the motion, and then I change pluck to push by changing the torsional rotation. If you were a kickboxer, pluck would be a jab and push would be a cross. From this position with all the weight on the right leg, that same switch from a jab cross ends up producing that. Pluck to push. We also see a similar action in repulse monkey in the strike. After we've stepped back with elbow strike, we're going to do pluck, extending from the right hip, which is going to allow the root to go to the left, allow the forefoot to pivot inwards, and then we go from pluck to push at the end. All of that's going to occur in one seemingly unbroken movement, so it's hard to see. But we're going from pluck to push. That's what's going to create the energy and allow you to pivot safely on that foot. So that's just a little example of how we combine rotations to create different techniques in the form. So I think I've gone through all 8 of the techniques, and correlated those with the 8 trigrams. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, click the like button and subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment and let me know what you think.